sells things like hyper-embroidered jeans. And the only thing I do not love about them is there are exactly 0 pockets anywhere.
When I learned that a lot of women's clothing comes with like the appearance of pockets that are literally so shut,
Right.
it just made me mad.
Right.
Like, yeah.
This is sewn shut. I could open it, and there is an actual functional pocket, but it destroys the line of the suit if you put anything in. That's why they keep them shut.
I'm like,
Yeah, I have jackets with the pockets sewn shut.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not uncommon. I don't think I've ever got a tailored jacket.
If I could remember the name of the store, I would provide it, but it's on Marcy Street, I can tell you.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that you said it's Santa Fe and caters to specialty indicates it's far out of my price.
Yeah.
They're not actually that bad for what they are. It was just one of those things that I looked in the store and I thought, these are so ridiculous. I have to try them on because they're so ridiculous. I want to see how stupid they. Fuck.
They're nice. They're nice. Okay.
I hate when this happens.
All right. Sartorial elements aside, let's go and get going here. So, thanks everybody. We're here for the panel 3 here, 3D. This is our panel on urban fantasies. We have some lovely panelists here to talk about it. So, first things first, I'm going to actually turn over and let our panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Walter John Williams. I have been a full-time professional writer for 45 years. I've written over 40 volumes of fiction. One a year. And I've never written urban fantasy, but I have written commentary on urban fantasy, so you get to have that.
My name's John Stith. I've written 10 plus science fiction novels, including Manhattan Transfer, which is in development for TV, and Redshift Rendezvous, which was a Nebula finalist. My most recent work was Disavowed in December.
Oh,
And
it was
I
called
too.
Disavowed. I thought you disavowed it.
No,
I was like, wait, why? What happened? What?
And I too have not written a urban fantasy novel.
Darynda Jones. I write paranormal mystery, young adult, all kinds of things. I thought I wrote urban fantasy, and technically it's urban fantasy. My agent just didn't want it to be shelved under urban fantasy because at that time when I sold, so this was back in 2009, urban fantasy was on that downslope. Now it's back up, but so they called it paranormal mystery. I have 35 books out. I fit New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, all the things. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Vivian Shaw. I technically write urban fantasy in as much as a lot of the things happening in my books take place in cities. Mine would also be shelved under paranormal fantasy or paranormal mystery. Like all of those, there's no one single thing that exactly fits any particular book. I have written the original trilogy of the Greta Helsing series. Then there is a ebook only novella which came out either late last year or early this year. But the final one in the series is called Strange New World, and that's coming out in May. And it has the best cover of the series, and you should buy it because of that.
Nice.
Well, thank you. So you might wonder, we just had several of our panelists indicate they don't do urban fantasy or they're not shelved under. So what are we doing in this panel? 2 things. First, I would indicate this is not necessarily a panel on urban fantasy. It is urban fantasy. So we're thinking about, narratives that are close to our world, but in a fantastical twist, or a fantastical component thereof.
I qualify.
Yeah. And their second part of it is this. Urban fantasy is itself such a widely defined topic. I've heard a lot of people discuss a lot of other genre components or texts that fit in it that I think are debatable, right? So full disclosure, I was the one that suggested this panel idea. And I will be full front, and this is my first question here. Part of why is I really enjoy urban fantasy. What I find tricky about it is, what is its actual defining characteristics? Because there are a number of things that I would call urban fantasy after you've read them, and comparing it to other things that other people refuse to call so. And then there are other things that people call urban fantasy that I wonder about, right? So I guess what I'd like to start is, what are your general thoughts are? What really makes urban fantasy tick as a genre?
Do me start.
Go.
Well, obviously, an urban setting. I think that's the biggest thing. But one of the things that I felt like why I thought I either wrote urban fantasy or paranormal romance because my romance is big in my Charlie Davidson series, but after doing more research, everybody's like, okay, if it's really urban fantasy, and this was a long time ago, they may have changed it by now, but if it was really urban fantasy, then you can take out the romance and the story still completely works. You still have the mystery elements, the paranormal element, the fantastical elements, the urban setting. It depends on you how much that fantasy world, the human world, knows about. They can either not know or know pretty much about it. But that, to me, that's what I think of urban fantasy. But I could be wrong. I don't. Things change all the time.
I would say that for me, urban fantasy has to, in some way, involve the city in the story. Like the city has to be not just a setting that happens to be where things are happening, but like something about the city as a setting is important to the story as a whole. Like the city's a character in some ways. Thinking of N.K. Jemison's books here, like the cities as like anthropomorphized characters themselves is like the ultimate urban fantasy, but stuff that just takes place in a city but could be lifted and put somewhere else without changing the story, I think that's not necessarily urban fantasy.
I think one group or a subgroup maybe that the dual world stories like Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman,
Yep.
where there's just a parallel existence of a number of people.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, urban fantasy's been around for a long, long time. I mean, Mary Shelley wrote urban fantasy, and Victorian writers did contemporary settings for supernatural stuff all the time. And John W. Campbell, who tried to sort of establish it as a genre with Unknown Magazine, which he edited along with Astounding, and he was in the business of revising science fiction on one magazine and kind of inventing a different kind of fantasy on the other. And it's very kind of a very engineer's approach to fantasy. And the wartime paper shortages in the 1940s kind of put an end to that experiment. And it's been going along. And I mean, The Night Stalker, if you remember that show, that was urban fantasy, definitely. But during the 80s, that particular label began to be applied to a certain kind of fantasy, the Terry Windling's Borderlands series, which was kind of open-ended and shared universe that a number of writers wrote. And it was basically a story set in a kind of supernatural Minneapolis, where fantasy was returning to this world. So the elves were coming back along with other things that associate with elves. And Emma Bull wrote War with the Oaks, which was a big thing. And so that was urban fantasy of the 80s. And it kind of faded away. And then we began getting this new stuff in the new century. And they were looking for a label for it. And urban fantasy was kind of available because nobody was using it. And so then, bang, it got employed. And what contemporary urban fantasy is rather different from the urban fantasy of the 80s, just in terms of tone and subject matter.
That's really interesting and how the time changes, right? I'm thinking of the 80s, it's also when we had like the rise of like Shadowrun, both as the game and then the spin-off novels, right?
Yeah.
Which are cyberpunk, but with that kind of element, right?
Yeah.
Rediscovering magic in that environment. So what would you say then is kind of typifies kind of current urban fantasy? If 80s urban fantasy is different, what's kind of the thread for kind of current, the urban fantasy of the 2020s?
But Jim Butcher is doing well with the Dresden series. So that's got to be part of that universe. But it sounds like you're a big part of that universe too.
Well, I thought so. I don't know. And I thought it's just such a cool name, urban fantasy. And somebody
Right.
told me, you write urban fantasy. I'm like, I'm in the cool group now? I've never been in the cool group. So I was very excited until my agent shot that down. But that's okay. Yeah, I really think that Jim Butcher is just doing an amazing job. Jane Yellowrock. Oh, she's one of my friends. I can't remember. Anyway, they're good too. The Jane Yellowrock series is very good. I can see her face, but yeah. And it's much more urban. Like her city, the cities really play a big part. She's a shapeshifter, and I think she has some Native American ancestry, and it's a very interesting world. Yeah.
I already mentioned N.K. Jemison's duology.
Yeah.
The worlds we make and the city we became. I was lucky enough to get to review one of those for Washington Post, which was kind of awesome. And it struck me immediately how not only is this an urban fantasy in as much as the characters are doing the things that they're doing and fighting the battles that they're fighting within New York City, and New York City is an active character, literally and figuratively. And like the boroughs are individual characters, and they are coming together to fight off like a shared foe. And it's an incredibly like sort of meta sensation to read urban fantasy about urban fantasy. And it's also like, it's so deftly done that even like regardless of genre, I would recommend that you guys read those.
Well, it is common for the setting to become a character in fantasy.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's a trope.
Yeah.
Gotham City.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gotham- Well, all of Middle Earth.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
mean, it's a character. You're exploring the nature of that character.
And Neverwhere London's a character, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remarked when you noted the city's a character in urban fantasy. My first thought was what I'm used to hearing the city's a character is Sex in the City. And I'm like, oh, so Sex in the City is an urban fantasy.
Yes, it
I did a lot of work. Well, yeah.
Based on how they get by. And
Right.
how their economic situation, it's certainly a fantasy. Well, what I do think is interesting is of a lot of the authors you all have mentioned, I think bridge genres as well, which is another part of the conversation I think is interesting. So you've got Butcher, who, especially in the early books, and later on he shifted around, although some of it's returning a little bit, was heavily involved in this amalgamation with the noir genre, right? You've got other folks, I forgot the name you said, Darynda, but I remember the books. I've read a couple
Yes.
of books, right?
Daniel.
I think her and Alona Andrews.
Yeah.
Well, that's bordering into paranormal romance.
Right. Which mine does too, I feel, yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think there's a number of, the kind of more prominent examples that bridge, right, into the genres. And so is there something about urban fantasy as a genre, in other words, that encourages this like bleed or borrowing from other genre elements?
I would mention steampunk too,
Oh, yeah.
because they quite frequently seem to go arm in arm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, for that matter, I would say cyberpunk, you could have a similar conversation.
Absolutely.
As I think about a couple of my own works that are marketed as science fiction, one centers on time travel, which really today is more fantasy than science fiction. And the other features heavy use of artificial intelligence. And I'm becoming more and more doubtful that we'll actually have a sentient computer. I'm more and more capable of reasoning and answering questions, but not, and it won't be self-aware unless we write it as
Right.
self-upgrading. I mean, so those are both fantasy in a way right now.
I don't know, I think part of it is the writers themselves, when they come up with their world and their characters and everything, and they're like, well, I can't it. We don't think in terms of that. Like when I'm writing something, I don't think, well, I'm going to write this urban fantasy. I'm sure some writers probably do, but I don't think, okay, so I need to fit all these rules in here. I just borrow from everything. I don't care.
Yeah, that was a big problem with steampunk. Is a lot of the writers who were attempting steampunk thought that there was this whole long list of rules that they have to follow. You know, with zeppelins and goggles and God knows what.
Right, and then
Years
the
on
same
it.
thing
Uh-huh.
It was an interesting
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
I think also there's the fact that the city is inherently a liminal space. There's people living in different levels of it. There's people who are unhoused, who are living wherever they can live. There's people who are on the streets. There's people who are transient, moving through, people who live there all the time, people who are visiting. It's all currently moving all the time and always changing, which gives you the opportunity to have all kinds of things happen that would be noticeable in a otherwise like sort of static system, but in the city they go unnoticed, and therefore you can get whole like subcultures built up without like the normies knowing about it. It gives you the ability to have stuff like, and also noir, because like cities are obviously crime ridden, so let's stuck some crime in there. It lends itself to collaboration, I think.
That's true.
So is there something, I like the thread you said there about this kind of undercurrent, right, this underculture. And I do think that's something we see in a lot of, you know, even in a broad interpretation, as I stated earlier, of urban fantasies of, you know, fantastical narratives in an urban setting. The common thread does seem to be that there is something going on, right, that a lot of people in the city don't know about, or perhaps aren't facing, right? But that the narrative focuses on or emphasizes. And so I guess that's a way to lead me into, you know, what is the kind of function of the city in the sense of being obfuscated, right? Is the kind of narrative of urban fantasy one of revelation, right? For people to face what has not been faced before, to, you know, encounter these other ideas? That wasn't a greatly formed question. I was just responding to what I was not 100%.
That's a great way to think
I,
about
I think a lot of urban fantasies, gee, it would be cool if I did this and this at the same time.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
the cool factor. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
necessarily,
it. Yeah.
I think there's also a factor of like, if I go to the big city, I'll find some people who are like me.
Mhm.
Like finding a subculture or like a community that you can actually like be part of in somewhere that's large enough that it supports that many different like diverse communities.
That's true.
now I had a kind of weird reaction to the urban fantasy of the 80s, which is that it prompted me to write a series that was arguably urban fantasy, although nobody read it that way. They thought it was science fiction. Even had magic and mages doing magic and stuff. They seemed to think this was some kind of weird technology. I think because I thought about it too hard. I sort of came out of the cyberpunk era, and one of the things that the cyberpunks did was we take this stuff that is science fiction, and if we think about it harder, we can come up with something new. Okay, and so what I came up with was an acronym, which was TOUGH, which is totally urban fantasy, in which the fantasy elements are created by the urban environment.
Mhm.
Okay, so you know, you don't have elves coming over from medieval Germany. You've got creatures that are created in some way by skyscrapers and subway systems and sewer systems and so on. And I tried to dial magic back to make it pure magic. It's essence of magic. It'll do whatever you want it to, assuming you can get a hold of some, because it's expensive. And I made magic a metered public utility. Okay, you can do magic as long as your meter lets you run it through the system.
That's cool.
And this book was, the first book was Metropolitan. It was meant to be one book. Okay. And I wrote Metropolitan, and this goes back to our earlier discussion of rewrites, that I had a very lovely outline for Metropolitan, and it was out of control from the second paragraph, I think. And so I realized I had 400 manuscript pages, and I'd covered the first 2 paragraphs of my outline.
Yeah,
So
that's a
then the
problem.
second book was City on Fire. And the third book I'm writing now 30 years later, 30 years late, because my editor got fired and his whole fiction line got canceled. So I never got to finish the series, and I've been promising it to people forever. But I can sort of see why people thought it was science fiction. Firstly, I was a science fiction writer. Secondly, I had flying cars that were magic, but flying cars and skyscrapers and all of that. All of the background was very sort of urban, and I had computers, but I mean, and nobody seemed to notice that they were analog computers with gears in them, as opposed to digital computers without gears in them. But the way I was describing them, yeah, because an analog computer, you can reconfigure it on the run, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you just start taking all the phone jacks out and putting them in different holes, and you configure it for a whole other kind of operation. So I had, people were deeply puzzled and deeply disappointed, because one of the things I wanted to do with this series, I had the world that it's cut off from the outside. There's this thing called the shield, and it totally surrounds the world, and nobody can get through it. And I was just trying to explain why they never left the world. It was like, you know, in a fantasy novel where you have the uncrossable desert, you know, written on the in the map on the front. You're not supposed to think about why it's uncrossable. It's just uncrossable. You can't cross it. Don't think. Okay. And
It just is.
You don't want to know.
yeah. But it was a problem. It was an obvious problem that these people on this planet needed to solve for it to be science fiction.
Mhm.
Science fiction is about solving problems. And so because I didn't solve the problem in the course of the text, they were really disappointed. And I told them, no, it's magic. It's fantasy novel. Reread it again, and you will see that it is an old story of an apprentice magician who surpasses her teacher. Right? Just, it's right there, black and white. I say it right out. But they thought I was hiding science somehow in any of this. And I said, well, this is clearly nanotechnology. No, it's not. Nanotechnology doesn't work like that. You have to be crazy to think nanotechnology works like that. So anyway, God knows why I want to revisit it now.
Good that we had this talk.
Yeah, right.
Is it time to?
I just got to the realization I don't have to write this book.
I think it is time to quote Quark. Quote a Clark.
Okay.
The sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It goes
Yeah.
both ways. So magic and technology are basically two ways to explain the same thing. I've played with this myself in my universe. I had to come up with a way to explain the magic system that actually made sense to me, that was internally consistent and could be described in terms that people would understand. And I came up with particle physics. It's like, oh shit, that actually is one-to-one exactly the same thing. So that actually gives me the ability to cheat, because I can just go and like use the same naming protocol for all of my like magic particles and subparticles and so on. And then no one will ever bother to know about this, because it's not necessarily even on the page that much.
Well, yeah,
But I like it.
anything can be magic.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you've read Max Gladstone's
Oh,
series,
yes,
but
yes.
it started with him. His wife was taking courses in law school, and she was doing contract law, and she was explaining it to him. Contract law is just a form of magic.
Yup.
And so he based
off
his
he
entire
went.
series just on that one revelation.
That's awesome. That's so funny. It was so funny when I read one of Patricia Briggs, her first book, Moon Called, I think is what was. I don't know. That wasn't her first book, but the first in that one series. And it was so funny because I was like, why does she keep saying that? So about every third or fourth chapter, she would explain her shape-shifting world as it's just magic. It just is. And I really feel like people like come at her at some point in her writing career. They're like, well, how does this happen? How does this work? And so she says it like 5 or 6 times in that first book. It's just magic. There's no explanation. It's just magic. It was so funny. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. By the way, third book, I do solve the problem of this shield, and boy, do I.
Nice.
Public demanded it. Okay, fine, you got it. See if you like it now.
That's what you get.
Well, the idea of this like scientific approach, I mean, this is where a lot of fantasy is now, right? A lot of fantasy is really focused on even not necessarily the hard systems of magic, right? But at least the explainable systems. You know, Butcher explains a lot of his magic is explained through thermodynamics, right?
Yes.
For Sanderson, it's a mix of things, but it's either, you know, he doesn't describe it as such, but it's functionally electrostatic charges, right, and from a chemical environment, right, and allomancy and other things. And so I think that the scientific approach is something we see regularly as a way to understand it. But it can be very limiting, as you've all noted, right? It can be frustrating. There's advantages, right, but also disadvantages.
Yeah.
So
Fun to play with.
Yeah.
here's my question. If we've talked about a lot of the benefits of these kind of urban fantastical kind of choices, right, of the city and things, what are some of the costs of placing a fantastical narrative in an urban environment?
I think one of the costs is, especially if you have it where the human world is not aware, I think that, I don't know that that's a cost. It's just a challenge in that, you know, okay, if all this stuff is happening and this building gets blown up and all this, you know, whatever all is happening, how is the human world not seeing that? So that's always a kind of a challenge. I wouldn't say it was a cost, but like a challenge on trying to come up with ways that it's not quite, yeah.
I call it a limitation,
Yeah.
like what you can get away with before somebody's gonna notice that
Right,
things
yeah.
are on fire.
Somebody's gonna figure this out.
Yep.
Yeah. What an actual cost.
There's also the fact that if you are inventing a completely new city that doesn't exist, you have to do a lot of world building in your own head, whether or not that ever makes it on the page, just so you know how long it's been there, how old is it, does it have a
Right.
subway system, is it on a river, was it originally with a completely different town that's built itself up into a city, and stuff like that you have to do the work on whether or not it ever actually shows up. But it's a lot of extra work, whereas in a fantasy setting that's like swords and sorcery and castles and stuff like that, there's still a lot of research and world building to be done, but it's a completely different flavor. There's less technology and more sort of geography.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I feel like once you set your world up, sometimes, 4 books down the line, 10 books down the line, you're like, oh, why did I do it that way? You come up with this great idea and you're like, well, no, I screwed that up. It's already set up. Or you can be like Sherilyn Kenyon and just break your own rules every time you write a new book.
So
Sorry,
frustrating.
Sherilyn. She doesn't like me anyway. It's okay.
It's not exactly the same world, but it makes me think of Sherry Tepper, who has written a number of science fiction novels that are written using fantasy conventions, fantasy sentence structure and vocabulary.
Yeah, and Dune has a totally fantasy structure. I mean, it's a lost prince who gets his kingdom back, and there are lots of sword fights, and there are great big monsters, and how he got all of that into a science fiction story that John W. Campbell actually bought for analog, I will never know.
Right. It's an amazing story.
Well, I've got one more question, and then we'll turn it over to everyone else. Just another thing that I think is interesting about urban fantasy. A trope I tend to see in it is a lot of urban fantasy has a focus on, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's glorification, but I would say a trope of violence, right? There's a lot of violence in the sense of physical, sometimes sexual, sometimes social, emotional, right? To the point where I've known people that are turned off of the genre at large or anything that smacks of it, right, for that very reason. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts, and it's something I deal with a lot of, I consume a lot of media that's violent, right? And while I enjoy it, I also recognize that if it were real life analog, of course I would want that.
Right.
So what do y'all think about this kind of tension between, violence, physical, sexual, social, emotional in this kind of genre?
I didn't have the perception that the ratio was greater in urban fantasy than in other genres. Maybe that's my ignorance, but I mean, a lot of other subgenres have plenty of that.
I mean, that's a very good point. Right?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I think possibly it may seem like there's more in urban fantasy because the kind of violence that the reader would experience is a kind of violence that they could experience in the real world.
That's interesting.
Like, it would be a kind of violence that they would feel immediately, like, I don't know, attacked by. Whereas if you're like, oh, well, if I go out, I could get like killed by bands of marauding D&D people, or like a dragon will eat me or something. As opposed to if I go out, I will get mugged and killed. And
Yeah.
there's a possibility that you get mugged and killed. So it seems a little more real, and that may be upsetting.
And I think
I know.
that's,
Go ahead.
I think that's a strength of urban fantasy for me too.
Yeah.
The fact that the whole world for me is more believable,
Yep.
more something I could imagine myself in more easily than the high fantasy.
I know one urban fantasy writer, and I will let her define this thing. But what she says is that urban fantasy is about young women coping with their rape.
Wow. There's so
Yeah.
much of that. That's
Yeah.
actually true.
Mhm.
I never thought of that, but
Well,
yeah.
you know, Vivian, I think your point's really interesting. That setting may have a lot to do with it in the sense of like what we'll accept. When I teach Shakespeare, I'm teaching a Shakespeare class right now. We often talk about setting and performance because, after all, Shakespeare's dramas are meant to be performed, right? Not just read. But one thing I always point out as an interesting example is a play that students are often troubled by is The Meaning of a Shrew. A modern audience has a lot of trouble with it, but it's a comedy in its context, and yet it's still regularly staged. People stage it all the time. But what I think is interesting is it's often staged in settings where people think, I think the behavior is a little more are acceptable. So I've seen it staged. As a pirate, Taming the Shrew. I've seen it staged as a kind of 1920s gangster, Taming the Shrew, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've seen it on I've seen 3 different productions, independent of each other, that stage it as a Wild West Taming the Shrew. And there's like this idea that rough and tumble environment
Yeah.
makes misogyny and gaslighting fine.
Right.
Well,
That makes
even
total
in
sense.
movies like Overboard, you know, it's.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
That's
Okay.
true. That's
Well,
true.
Overboard, and that list of movies you watch when you're, less critical, and then you go back and watch them later, it's like, oh no.
Right. Right.
I've seen a Taming of the Shrew that was set in World War II Italy, immediately after the war, and with Petruchio as a American soldier.
Oh, that's
And there are pieces in it that fit exactly, because if you were an American officer, how do you train your soldiers? You march them up and down hills, you starve them of food, you don't give them any comforts, and that's exactly what he does to Kate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they even dressed her in a uniform just to make this clear that that's what was going on.
That's interesting.
Well, very cool. Well, I could keep
Okay.
poking around these subjects, but we really should turn to questions in the audience. Shauna first, yeah.
I really enjoyed this discussion, and I was thinking as we were talking about some of the challenges of urban fantasy, one of the things that Darynda mentioned was, keeping the ignorant, mundanes, from seeing things. And I think that is a feature of what Farah Mendelssohn calls intrusive fantasy. And we see a lot of that, in rhetorics of fantasy, that the urban fantasies get characterized as magic intruding upon the ordinary urban world.
That's true.
But she has those other categories too, of portal quest fantasy or the immersive fantasy. And we see Vivian mentioned like an entirely new city that stands alone, that doesn't exist before, that could be immersive. But I always find that the liminal fantasy that she talks about, where the line between magical and mundane are blurred, is the best for me for understanding urban fantasy. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that blurring of lines between the mundane and the magical, and how the city lends itself to that.
That's interesting.
I don't know about that particular question yet, but suddenly I'm seeing Superman in a different light.
I find that kind of setting where like magic is not something that's hidden. Magic is something that is part of everyday life, but not necessarily everyone's everyday life. Like there are some people who engage with it and there are people who never touch it at all, but it's accepted as a thing, as part of people's lives. That gives you so much more scope to write. Like you can write all kinds of stuff about conflict between the two,
Right.
the laws that might involve like how you're allowed to use magic, how much it costs, how do you pay for it,
Yeah.
all that stuff. I love the opportunity to play with something like that because it gives me so much more scope to investigate how things go wrong.
Yeah, and to me, the power differential would just be
Mm.
amazing. It would be like, I just feel like humans would either be oppressed, but if you look at what's Sookie Stackhouse, what is that called? That show, what is it?
True Blood.
Thank you.
True Blood, yes. Her world, the humans knew, and then it was actually the vampires who were oppressed and, hunted or whatever. Not really hunted, but what would you say?
Other?
I can't think of words.
Captivated and bled as a drug.
Yes. Sorry.
Oh, I did have a question. So I'm like, because urban fantasy is so broad and it can be used in so many different ways, how do you sell an urban fantasy book as an urban fantasy, like in that category? Like, how do you begin to approach that, or even be like, hey, look, you guys, this is interesting.
Well, I did it badly, so.
First step is become a literary agent.
Right.
Because your agent is the one who sells it,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
your agent is going to be the one who, in your case,
Yeah.
made a decision
Yeah.
that they were going to sell it in
Mhm.
that particular
Yeah, she refused
direction.
to, because I even pitched it, I believe, in my query letter as urban fantasy. And she was like, yeah, we're not calling it.
Because they know what's currently selling and
Right.
what's more likely to get you to a point where you'll get published.
Right.
And it's not that they think that you're wrong. It's that they think that this is more likely to be a successful thing to pitch to potential editors.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the broader view is just contemporary fantasy, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, if you look at, say, the Outlander series, which was intended as a science fiction series
Mhm.
by its author, and she talked to her agent, and the agent said, well, I could sell this as science fiction for $6,000, or I could sell it as whatever the appropriate
Time
category.
travel fantasy.
Yeah, right.
Paranormal
Paranormal fantasy for $600,000. Which would you prefer?
Yeah,
And
let's
it-
put
yeah.
the zero on the end.
Yeah. Those zeros are nice.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? Because I do think it's interesting. I've heard a lot of y'all speak over the years about genres are tricky because it's the literary agents that put in the genre, right? Genres are mainly a marketing category, not actually what people are writing for, right? What I think is interesting is exactly what y'all are just talking about, is it seems like there's also a feedback loop. That once you're locked in a category, a genre, and you write in that genre, and you want to maintain that audience, it sometimes shapes how people continue to write.
Absolutely.
So how does that affect you going forward, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can think of examples on both sides, like Asimov wrote everything under one name, and that worked.
Mhm.
But not everyone has his selling power, except maybe.
No.
I think of Shauna McGuire, who writes as Mira Grant as well. I don't actually know exactly what the differences are between the genres there, but she definitely has at least 2 separate pseudonyms to write this series and that series.
Yeah.
I think it's just Sean McGuire doesn't want to have more than one book out a month under their name. I mean, that would,
It's impressive.
It does kind
It's
of,
impressive.
Yeah, I would say that too. And your audience too. I mean, I have 2 different series that I'm seriously considering a pseudonym because I'm like, I don't know.
Mhm.
Even though I write in paranormal mystery,
Mhm.
young adult. Yeah, I'll probably have a pseudonym someday.
and it didn't help.
Mm. Really? Did you? What else did you?
It was a book called The Rift, which is sort of borderline science fiction, but it's
Oh, yeah.
It's
No, I love
basically
it.
about the consequences of an enormous earthquake on the New Madrid Fault in Missouri, right? Which is the most dangerous earthquake fault in the world, by the way, and it's
Yeah.
getting to be time to kick it off.
Yeah.
But it was sort of wanted it to be a huge best-selling book, and that was, and so they thought we'll give him a transparent pseudonym, so that his regular readers will find him, and then it'll be a new name to everyone else. So that went out as Walter J. Williams,
Okay.
kind of transparent, I'd say. But
yeah.
you know, and then basically the publisher shut it down.
Oh.
The publisher refused to allow it to be promoted in any way because they wanted to destroy the science fiction line. It was. This is Harper. Harper was losing $80 million a year. The only profitable subfield they had was science fiction and fantasy, which was making money hands over fist. And so they were making everyone else look bad, and they had to be destroyed. And so they very deliberately set out to destroy their own science fiction, profitable science fiction line.
New York is crazy.
It's getting very Hollywood out there. Yeah.
So I was at my very first lectureship, and I was in the special collections, and I was just looking at books, and I pulled out the Rift, and I was like, oh, this looks so good. And I'm reading through it. And this man comes up behind me and goes, I heard that's a really good book. Really? It's like, okay. And I yeah, of course. And then when he told me, I was like, you wrote this book. I was freaking out. I fangirled really hard.
There was a hand over here. Was it Kevin? Did you have a hand over here? Thought I saw it.
Kevin's like, don't call my name.
Okay, sorry. All right, then it's open field. All right, who else? Yeah, Kelsey.
Yeah, so what themes would you associate with urban fantasy, or what themes do you think the genre is ripe for?
I think we need to differentiate between theme and trope here. Like, I tend to think of trope as like paranormal fantasy.
Right.
Like the vampires they're the good guys and they're hiding out in the city because of reasons. But themes are more likely to be like, I don't know, redemption, that kind of
Right.
thing, or like
Yeah.
searching for something that you don't know what it is you lost and you hope you'll find it.
Yeah.
I don't know, like urban fantasy always strikes me as being deeply suited towards not exactly redemption, but a kind of like looking for explanations for something and hoping to find an answer for why something went wrong. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't. Oh, go ahead. Oh, Kevin, actually.
One thing that I was considering is whenever I think of urban fantasy, I'm thinking modern cities, but would you say that, for example, 1800s London, would that be considered urban fantasy as far as you guys, what would you guys say?
There's a book by Catherine Addison called Angel of the Crows, which is set in a sort of magic paranormal London circa Sherlock Holmes. It's actually about Dr. Watson in this particular like back to front world. And it's absolutely wonderful. And there's magic and angels and yes, it's London. Yes, it's the 1800s. So look that one up. Angel of the Crows.
I think it just depends on how urban it gets.
Yeah.
I mean, Victorian London's pretty damn urban. but,
Yeah, it's
you know,
pretty urban.
18th century London, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
The
And
middle of
then
it,
then it
yes.
becomes historical fantasy, which is, you know,
Right.
Yeah, true.
That's where my brain kind of wants to put that.
Interesting.
And I have another one for you guys. So, whenever you think of urban fantasy, I know scenery plays a big part in it, almost character, or at the very least, it affects the narrative. Do you find that in urban fantasy storytelling, the scenery changes with the narrative, or do you think it stays kind of a constant throughout? How would that work, do you think? Or how would that be marketed?
Do you mean through the whole genre, or like just like one series? I'm not sure.
Or, well, I'm thinking about like the genre. Do you think in urban fantasies, the scenery changes? Can it change? How is that? How flexible and not flexible is that?
Do you mean like during the course of a book, for instance, or?
Yeah, like, or to kind of give an example, like if magic is a part of the world, it is part of the culture, and although I or my character or whatever, you can use magic, the magic itself doesn't really change. versus like, let's say, I'm in a world that doesn't know about magic, but as the course of the book goes through, magic is too big and it gets exposed, and therefore the world is changing with the magic. So,
Yeah.
like, how is that then just fantasy, or like, how does like urban fantasy kind of interweave? Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I would think the umbrella is big enough for both those kinds of books.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the core things of urban fantasy, though, is that there's a relatively small cast, and they all have very intense interactions with each other. And
That's true.
so if it gets too big, it becomes something else, I think.
And keep in mind also
Yeah.
that any given city is going to have a whole bunch of different types of scenery.
Mhm.
Like there's the subways, there's the skyscrapers, there's Central Park, there's roads, there's suburbs, there's like Queens. And all of those will be what they are, and your narrative can move between them. But each of those is probably not going to change a hell of a lot during the course of an individual story.
Yeah. But you can have either. But I don't know how much it would change in like one book, say, something like that. Interesting.
Other questions?
The definition you said of urban fantasy kind of in the beginning of the panel here was pretty broad. So I did kind of have a question about, like the more fantastical settings. Like most of the ones you've established seem to be set like on Earth in a real modern day city. But what about things like Terry Pratchett with Discworld on Corporate, where it's it's obviously a big city that does have analogs with real places. Anyway, I just wanted to hear your take on that.
I would say Guards, and Night Watch are absolutely urban fantasy. Like the city, in fact, so are Going Postal and Making Money. In Making Money, Moist actually writes on one of the banknotes that he's designing ad urbum pertinet, it's about the city, which is what Veterinary always says. So I think you can't like make any case that those are not urban fantasy. And I love the way he does that, and he slides that between like typical fantasy tropes and makes it like just seamless. One of Pratchett's best qualities.
Seems amazing. Yeah, I had never thought of that, but yeah, I can totally see where that would be.
Yep.
Yeah, urban setting.
I
Interesting.
mean, I was having similar thoughts about, Stephen Bruce Taltosh books, which are very urban, yet fantasy, right? They're also semi his own fanfic about rewriting Dumas's books in a fantasy setting, but they're still very urban, right? And deal with that.
Yeah.
Or I think it's Scott Lynch's Liza Lamora, right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Very urban,
Yeah.
yet
Yeah.
still fully fantasy,
Yeah.
right? You could argue a lot of elements of Codex Alera are still like that. So it is an interesting
Mhm.
mix-up, right?
It is.
Well, I think taking sword and sorcery and putting it in an urban setting doesn't make it urban fantasy along the sort of lines that we've been talking about.
Right.
Well, the question is then, why is the sword and sorcery happening in the urban setting?
Mhm.
Like, is it just because the sword and sorcery is the point and they happen to be in a city?
Mhm.
In which case I would concur it's not really urban
Well,
fantasy,
yeah,
it just
yeah, well,
happens to be in
the city happens to have a treasure of gold that the hero wants. I don't know. That's,
Yes.
it's.
But like that sort of thing would I would definitely classify that as fantasy in an urban setting, but not necessarily urban fantasy.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Sure.
Earlier you mentioned the Dresden Files and sort of noir influences, and the idea that, the city can be this asphalt jungle of corruption and vice, and that there's this undercurrent of violence. And I was thinking about the ones who walk away from Montmartre, for example, where the society is propped up on the suffering of innocence, and that the machinery of the community requires the sacrifice of someone frail. And Naomi Novik's Scholomance, Deadly Education, etc. series is playing with that trope as well, that the enclaves are built on Malia, bad magic, and that something about the city requires it to be this jungle of vice. And I wanted to know if that idea of the inherent combative and violent and corrupting nature of the city is an more influence. Is there something that is in a lot of urban fantasy, or if it's just a subtype?
I had the impression of a subtype myself.
Yeah.
It seems to me there's often a sort of balance between the idea the city is this, like, I don't know, hive of scum and villainy,
Right, yes.
and the city as this, like, bustling melting pot where people of all backgrounds can work together and, like, build community. And the thing is that it can't really just be one of those all the time. I think it does have to be both. In The Snow Queen by Joan Benji, there is a description of the main city on the planet Tiamat, which is named Carbuncle, because it's either a jewel or a fester, depending on who you ask. I mean, there you go, trope namer.
Yeah.
But I think it's got to be both. Like, you can't really just lean on cities are evil or cities are great.
Questions? Yeah, please.
How big does the setting have to be an urban fantasy? Because somebody brought up True Blood Suki Stackhouse, which often gets classified as urban, but part of the point of that book is it's a very rural setting and a very, very small town.
That's true.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I
There
see
has
that.
to be 250,000.
I was gonna say-
I'm just kidding, I don't know.
Census
I didn't
page,
think about
please.
that.
I'm
To
just
check.
thinking there was like a quirky small town Twin Peaks sort of genre that you saw
Right.
kind of emerge maybe 30 years ago, which you don't hear much of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would fall under the contemporary fantasy.
Yeah, like
Not
contemporary,
the city.
right, yeah.
Well, you mentioned Patricia Briggs earlier, right?
Yes.
All of her books are kind of city adjacent. but
That's
not
what I'm
necessarily
thinking. They're
fantasy.
like on the outskirts or something. They're like, there's the city, but the city doesn't really play a big role or anything. So,
Even
yeah.
Alona Andrews, right? It's set in like a southern city that's like separated a little
Right,
bit, right? So
right.
it's not exactly, it's that kind of southern urban sprawl, right?
Yeah,
So it doesn't really
yes,
feel quite the same.
Yes,
Interesting.
very true.
Well, obviously it's hard to pin down. That's the thing we've been dealing with, with her. So I guess a question I have for all of you is, what are some urban fantasy narratives you'd recommend? Things that you would call urban fantasy?
Well, I was going to say Patricia Briggs, but no, I guess I won't. Yeah, mine always lead toward the romance part too. Just so you know.
Well, the Percy Jackson series probably fits
Oh,
that too. Buffy.
Oh, you can't beat Buffy. Buffy's awesome. I'm trying to remember the Jane Yellow run. And
There's a TV series, I'm spacing out the name, from about 5 or 6 years ago. I want to say Drew Barrymore, bitten by a vampire.
yeah, by a zombie.
By a zombie.
Mhm.
Santa Clara Diet, yeah.
Santa Clara.
Santa Clarita Diet.
Faith Hunter, that's Jane Yellow. She's a really good friend of mine. Please don't tell her I forgot her name. She's awesome. Hers are really good. For me, my hardest thing to separate, because to me, paranormal romance, and a lot of people in the paranormal romance world call it urban fantasy, but I really don't think it fits that really. So yeah, it just, urban fantasy became the big catchphrase there for a few years.
Mhm.
And so everybody wanted to write urban fantasy. And then, it's just trends.
I think also trends, while they pass, you can also get sort of reclassed as time goes by. It's like,
Right.
oh, that was originally sold as urban fantasy, but
Mhm.
now we're basically characterizing it as paranormal romance or
Yeah.
whatever. Like, there are at least 2 or 3 separate categories in which I've seen my books listed, and I honestly don't know which one of them is the one I'm supposed to lean on most.
Right.
Like, Until the editors give me actual guidance on that, I'm like, well, it's this, or some combination thereof.
Yeah.
But in terms of recommending urban fantasy, like I said, N.K. Jemisin and Catherine Addison, and definitely, if you haven't already read all of the Discworld books set in Ankh-Morpork, you should go read all of the Discworld books set in Ankh-Morpork because it's a wonderful, horrible city.
Oh, yes. Very precious. So good.
Well,
Do you have
great. Let's give her our panelists again. Thank you so much. And all of you, this is our last panel for the day. For the Williamson Lectureship, we have one final event that occurs tomorrow. It is Connie Lois's workshop on writing. It'll take place across the hall in that room. There will be coffee and other refreshments. Many of our authors come along and chime in. It's a great conversation.
It's totally
So if you're
worth
so
it.
inclined,
You should go.
please come along. Otherwise, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you. Again, I knew this was going to be like a search on the topic.
I know, this was like.
But good job.